in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, where trust was scarce and survival was everything, one man's simple act of kindness would change history forever. When Cowboy Jake Thornton found a dying child in the desert, he had no idea that saving that boy's life would forge an alliance that would shake the very foundations of the Wild West. This is the extraordinary true story of how compassion bridged two worlds, and how honor became the ultimate weapon against tyranny. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1873. Jake Thornton wiped the sweat from his weathered face as his horse trudged through the endless expanse of red sand and scattered sagebrush. At 32 years old, Jake had spent the better part of a decade working cattle drives and odd ranching jobs, drifting from town to town with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a tattered code of honor that his father had instilled in him before dying in the Civil War. Jake was a man of few words, hardened by loss and loneliness, yet beneath his rough exterior beat the heart of someone who still believed in doing right by others, even when the world had done him wrong. That particular afternoon, Jake was 3 days into a solo journey from Tucson to a ranch near the Gila River where he'd been promised work. The route was treacherous, cutting through territory where tensions between settlers and the Apache people had reached a boiling point. The U.S. Army had been pushing the indigenous tribes onto reservations, and skirmishes were common. Most cowboys avoided this path entirely, but Jake needed the work, and he'd never been one to take the long way around trouble. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Jake noticed something unusual in the distance. At first, he thought it was just another rock formation or perhaps a small animal, but as he drew closer, his heart sank. Lying motionless in the sand was the small figure of a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old. Jake dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with purpose as he rushed to the boy's side. The child was Apache, that much was clear from his clothing and the traditional markings on his small leather vest. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, his skin burning with fever. He was barely breathing. Jake had seen death enough times to recognize its approach, and this boy was dancing on its doorstep. Without hesitation, Jake scooped the child into his arms, noting how light he felt, like a bird with hollow bones. He carried him to the shade of a nearby outcropping of rocks and immediately began administering water from his canteen. Just drops at first to wet the boy's lips and tongue, then small sips as the child's eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again. Jake knew he had a choice to make. The ranch was still 2 days away, and this child needed more help than Jake could provide alone. But turning back to Tucson meant losing the job, and jobs were scarce for a drifter with no family and no prospects. More than that, though, Jake knew that bringing an Apache child into a white settlement could spell trouble. The hatred between the two peoples ran deep, stained with blood on both sides. Some settlers would call him a traitor for helping the enemy. Some might even try to take the boy from him, or worse. But as Jake looked down at the child's face, peaceful despite his suffering, he saw only innocence. He saw a son someone was desperately searching for. He saw himself as a boy, before the war had taken his father and the world had grown cold. The decision made itself. Jake fashioned a makeshift shelter using his bedroll and some branches, creating shade for the boy. He spent the rest of the day and all through the night tending to the child, giving him water, using wet cloths to bring down the fever, and sharing what little food he had. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words in Apache that Jake couldn't understand, sometimes crying out what must have been his mother's name. By dawn, the child's fever had broken, and his breathing had steadied. His eyes, dark and intelligent, opened fully for the first time and fixed on Jake with a mixture of fear and confusion. Jake spoke softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He offered food and water, which the boy accepted tentatively. They couldn't communicate with words, but Jake hoped his actions spoke clearly enough. As the sun rose higher, Jake knew he had to make another decision. The boy was too weak to travel far, but staying in the open desert was dangerous for both of them. Jake decided to head west toward the mountains, where he remembered seeing smoke from Apache camps during previous travels. It was a risk that could cost him his life, but it was the right thing to do. He would return the boy to his people. The journey toward the mountains was slow and treacherous. Jake fashioned a sling from his blanket so the boy could rest against his chest as they rode, conserving the child's strength while keeping him stable. The child, whom Jake had started calling Little Hawk in his mind because of the alert way the boy's eyes scanned the horizon, grew stronger with each passing hour. By midday, he was able to sit up on his own, though he remained silent, watching Jake with cautious eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. As they traveled, Jake couldn't help but reflect on the irony of his situation. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, keeping his distance from causes and conflicts, yet here he was, riding directly into the heart of Apache territory with one of their children. His fellow cowboys would call him crazy, the army would call him a fool, and the settlers he'd known in Tucson would likely call him a traitor. But something about this felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for a very long time. Perhaps it was the simple clarity of purpose, or perhaps it was the reminder that beneath all the violence and hatred, there was still room for basic human decency. They made camp that evening in a small canyon, sheltered by towering red rock walls that glowed like embers in the setting sun. Jake built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, which the boy ate hungrily. As they sat across from each other, the firelight dancing between them, Jake tried to communicate through gestures. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly. The boy watched carefully, then pointed to himself and spoke a word in Apache that sounded like Nako. Jake repeated it, earning the smallest hint of a smile from the child. It was progress. That night, as Jake kept watch under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, he heard sounds in the darkness. The soft footfall of unshod horses, the barely perceptible rustle of movement through brush. They were being watched. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but he forced himself to remain calm. If the Apache had wanted them dead, they would be dead already. The watchers were likely scouts, observing, trying to understand why a white man was traveling with one of their children. Jake did nothing to appear threatening. He simply tended the fire and kept the boy safe, hoping his intentions were clear. The next morning, Jake woke to find small offerings left at the edge of their camp. Dried meat wrapped in leaves, a small pouch of what looked like medicinal herbs. The boy, Nako, saw them and his face lit up with recognition and relief. He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing excitedly, clearly understanding that his people were near. Jake felt both relief and trepidation. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and he had no idea how it would unfold. They broke camp and continued westward, climbing higher into the foothills. By noon, they were no longer alone. Apache warriors began to appear on the ridges above them, their presence no longer concealed. There were at least a dozen that Jake could see, likely more hidden from view. Each warrior was armed and watching with intense focus. Jake kept his hands visible, his rifle secured on his saddle, his posture non-threatening. The boy called out to the warriors, his voice carrying up the canyon walls, and several of them descended quickly, moving with the fluid grace of men who knew this land as intimately as their own heartbeat. The first warrior to reach them was tall and imposing, his face marked with the scars of battle, his eyes hard with suspicion. He spoke sharply to the boy, who responded quickly, gesturing to Jake repeatedly. The warrior's eyes never left Jake's face as he listened. Other warriors surrounded them now, a circle of armed men whose expressions ranged from curiosity to barely contained hostility. Jake remained mounted but kept both hands visible on the saddle horn, every muscle in his body tense but still. One wrong move, one gesture interpreted as threatening, and he would die here. He accepted that possibility with a strange calm. After what felt like an eternity, the tall warrior approached Jake's horse and extended his hand, palm up, in a universal gesture. He wanted Jake to dismount and follow. Jake complied slowly, his movements deliberate and clear. The warrior took the boy from Jake's arms, and for a moment, Jake felt an unexpected pang of loss. In just 2 days, he'd grown protective of the child. The warrior examined the boy carefully, checking him for injuries, speaking to him in low tones. Nako responded earnestly, pointing to Jake several times, clearly explaining what had happened. The mood shifted subtly. The hostility didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, replaced by something more complex. The tall warrior approached Jake again and placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking words Jake couldn't understand but whose meaning seemed clear. There was acknowledgement in the gesture, perhaps even respect. The warrior then signaled to the others, and Jake found himself being escorted deeper into the mountains, not as a prisoner, but as something else entirely. As they walked, Jake realized his life had just taken a turn from which there would be no going back. He had crossed an invisible line, and whatever waited on the other side would define him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The Apache village was hidden in a high valley, sheltered by steep cliffs and accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended. As Jake was led into the encampment, he became acutely aware of the eyes upon him. Women paused in their work, children stopped playing, and warriors stationed throughout the village turned to watch the unusual sight of a white cowboy being brought into their midst. The atmosphere was thick with tension, curiosity, and barely concealed anger. Jake understood their hatred. He'd seen what the army and settlers had done to their people. The broken treaties, the massacres, the systematic destruction of their way of life. He was brought to the center of the village, where a large fire pit smoldered. The tall warrior who had first approached him, whose name Jake would later learn was Daklugi, spoke with several elders who had gathered. The discussion was animated, with Daklugi gesturing toward Jake and the boy, who still clung close to the warrior. One elder, a woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through to Jake's soul, listened intently before rising and approaching Jake directly. She walked around him slowly, examining him as one might examine a horse at market, then spoke sharply in Apache. When Jake didn't respond, she switched to broken English. "You child. Why?" Her voice was rough but clear, demanding truth. Jake met her eyes steadily and spoke simply. "Because he needed help. Because it was right." The elder woman studied him for a long moment, then said something to the gathered crowd. A murmur rippled through the assembled people. She turned back to Jake. "Many white men kill Apache child. Not safe. You different. Maybe." There was skepticism in her voice, but also something else, a willingness to withhold judgment. What happened next surprised everyone, including Jake. A woman broke through the crowd, running toward them with tears streaming down her face. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with long dark hair and eyes filled with desperate hope. She cried out when she saw the boy, and Nako's face transformed with joy. "Shima!" He shouted, the Apache word for mother, and ran into her arms. Mother and son collapsed together, both sobbing, her hands frantically checking him for injuries, his arms wrapped tightly around her neck as if he'd never let go. The woman, Nako's mother, whose name was Dawa, held her son for several long minutes before she seemed to remember herself. She lifted her head and looked directly at Jake, tears still flowing freely. She stood, pulling Nako up with her, and walked toward Jake with purpose. For a moment, Jake thought she might strike him, but instead, she did something that hushed the entire gathering. She knelt before him, placing Nako's small hand in Jake's weathered one. and spoke words in Apache that trembled with emotion. An interpreter, an older man who stepped forward from the crowd, translated quietly. "She says you gave her back her life. She says you are blessed by the mountain spirits. She says her family owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Jake felt uncomfortable with such gratitude. He gently helped Dawa to her feet and spoke through the interpreter. "I did what anyone should do. The boy needed help. I'm just glad he's home safe." But even as he said it, Jake knew that wasn't entirely true. Not anyone would have done what he did. Most wouldn't have even stopped. Most would have seen an Apache child and kept riding, or worse. His actions had been exceptional precisely because they were so rare, and that reality made Jake's heart heavy with sadness for what the world had become. The elder woman spoke again, this time with authority that commanded silence. Through the interpreter, Jake learned her name was Goyan, and she was the grandmother of the chief who led this band of Apache. She declared that Jake would be given food, rest, and safe passage from their territory whenever he chose to leave. But then she added something that made Jake's blood run cold. She told him that 3 days ago, the same day Nako had gone missing during a hunting expedition, soldiers from Fort Bowie had attacked a peaceful Apache camp to the south. 37 people had been killed, mostly women and children. The violence was escalating, and trust between their peoples had been shattered beyond what might ever be repaired. Jake's act of kindness was a rare light in growing darkness, but darkness was winning. That night, Jake was given a place to sleep and food to eat. Dawa brought him a meal personally, with Nako hovering close by, unwilling to leave his mother's side. She spoke through the interpreter, thanking Jake again and telling him the story of how Nako had wandered away from the hunting party, chasing a rabbit, and had become lost in the desert. They had searched for 2 days before the attack by soldiers had forced them to retreat to the safety of the village. They had thought Nako was dead. Jake's arrival with her son was nothing short of miraculous in her eyes. As Jake watched mother and son together, he felt something shift inside him, a purpose beginning to take shape that he didn't yet fully understand but could feel pulling at him like a current in deep water. Jake woke the next morning to find the village transformed in subtle ways. Where there had been suspicion, there was now cautious acceptance. Children who had hidden behind their mothers now peeked at him with open curiosity. Warriors who had gripped their weapons in his presence now nodded in acknowledgement as he passed. He was still an outsider, still a representative of a people who had brought death and suffering to the Apache. But he was also the man who had saved Nako, and that meant something profound in a culture where acts of honor and courage were the currency of respect. Daklugi approached Jake after breakfast, gesturing for him to follow. They walked to the edge of the village where several warriors were gathered, and through a combination of gestures, broken English, and the occasional translation from the interpreter, Jake learned something that made his stomach drop. The soldiers from Fort Bowie were planning another attack, this one larger and more coordinated. Scouts had reported that the army was gathering forces, planning to sweep through the territory and force all Apache onto reservations, using whatever violence was necessary to accomplish that goal. The attack could come within days. The warriors were preparing for war, making weapons, fortifying their defensive positions, and sending their families to more remote hiding places in the mountains. But Daklugi explained through the interpreter that they were vastly outnumbered. The soldiers had rifles, cannons, and seemingly endless reinforcements. The Apache were fierce warriors who knew this land intimately, but they were also exhausted from years of fighting, their numbers depleted by disease and warfare, their resources stretched thin. Daklugi looked at Jake with an expression that asked a silent question. Where do you stand? Jake spent that day wrestling with a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could leave right away from this village and never look back, return to his solitary existence working cattle and avoiding entanglements. No one would blame him. He'd done his good deed by saving the boy. He owed these people nothing more. But as he watched families preparing for what might be their last days, as he saw Nako playing with other children who might not live to see their next birthdays, as he observed warriors sharpening weapons with the grim determination of men who knew they were likely going to die, Jake realized he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not from this. That evening, Jake approached Goyan and the Council of Elders through the interpreter. He told them he wanted to help, but he needed to understand their full situation first. What followed was a long night of discussion, with maps drawn in the dirt and strategies debated. Jake learned that there were other Apache bands scattered throughout the territory, some willing to fight, others hoping to negotiate peace, all of them struggling to survive. He learned about the corruption among Indian agents, the broken promises, the systematic theft of resources that had been guaranteed by treaty. He learned about leaders like Geronimo and Cochise, who had fought valiantly but were now aging, their power waning. The picture that emerged was one of a proud people being slowly strangled by forces too powerful to resist directly. But Jake also learned about the Apache way of warfare, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, their ability to move unseen through land that seemed empty to untrained eyes, their networks of communication that could spread information across hundreds of miles in days. They weren't helpless. They were incredibly skilled and resourceful. What they lacked was not courage or ability, but numbers, supplies, and most critically, allies. The white settlers saw them as savages to be eliminated. The Mexican government to the south wanted them gone. They were surrounded by enemies on all sides. One man's act of kindness, no matter how genuine, couldn't change that fundamental reality. Or could it? Jake proposed something radical. He would go to Fort Bowie himself, not as a warrior, but as a mediator. He would speak to the commanding officer about the Apaches' willingness to negotiate, about the humanity of people like Nako and Dawa, about the possibility of peace. He had no illusions about the likely outcome. The Army wasn't known for its compassion toward indigenous peoples, and one cowboy's testimony would likely be dismissed or ignored. But he had to try. If nothing else, he might be able to gather intelligence about the Army's plans, information that could help the Apache prepare their defense. The elders listened to his proposal in silence. Then Goyan spoke, and the interpreter translated her words carefully. She said that Jake's courage honored them, but she also said that he would likely die for nothing. The soldiers would call him a traitor, maybe even hang him. Was he truly willing to risk that? Jake thought of his father, who had died believing in causes worth fighting for. He thought of all the years he'd spent drifting, avoiding commitment, protecting himself from the pain of caring too much. He thought of Nako's face when reunited with his mother, that pure expression of love and relief. And he knew his answer. Yes, he was willing to risk it, because some things were worth dying for, and the lives of innocent people were among them. That night, as Jake prepared for his journey to Fort Bowie, Dawa approached him with Nako at her side. She placed a small leather pouch in his hand, a medicine bag blessed by their shaman. She told him through the interpreter that the spirits would guide him, and that her son's life was forever bound to his. No matter what happened at Fort Bowie, Jake had already changed the course of destiny. He just didn't yet understand how profoundly. The ride to Fort Bowie took Jake a full day, and with every mile, he questioned his sanity. What was he doing? He was a nobody, a drifter cowboy with no influence, no power, no leverage. What made him think he could change anything? But he kept riding because turning back felt like a betrayal of something fundamental, something that went deeper than logic or self-preservation. When the fort came into view, its wooden walls and guard towers stark against the desert landscape, Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest. He was riding into the lion's den, and the lions were hungry. He was stopped at the gate by armed soldiers who looked at him with immediate suspicion. A cowboy riding in alone from Apache territory, looking weathered and carrying Apache crafts. He was interrogated roughly, his weapons confiscated, his story questioned at every turn, but Jake was persistent. He demanded to speak with the commanding officer, claiming he had information about Apache movements and intentions. It was technically true, though not in the way the soldiers assumed. After an hour of waiting under guard, Jake was finally brought before Captain Marcus Brennan, the officer in charge of the planned campaign against the Apache. Brennan was a career soldier, hardened by years of frontier warfare, his face weathered like old leather, his eyes cold and calculating. He listened to Jake's story about finding Nako and returning him to his people with barely concealed contempt. When Jake finished, Brennan leaned back in his chair and spoke with brutal honesty. "Let me tell you what I see, Thornton. I see a foolish man who helped savages and now thinks that makes him some kind of peacemaker. Those Apache you're so concerned about, they've killed settlers, attacked supply wagons, butchered women and children. They're obstacles to progress, and obstacles get removed. That's how the world works." Jake tried to reason with Brennan, explaining that the Apache attacks were responses to broken treaties and unprovoked violence by settlers and soldiers. He spoke about Nako, about Dawa, about families who just wanted to live in peace on land that had been theirs for generations. But with every word, he could see Brennan's expression hardening. The captain wasn't interested in nuance or compassion. He had his orders, he had his worldview, and nothing Jake said was going to change that. Finally, Brennan stood and delivered his verdict. "I could have you arrested for aiding the enemy, Thornton. I could hang you as a traitor. But I'm going to do you a favor because you seem more stupid than malicious. Get out of this territory. Go back east, go north, go to California, I don't care. But if I see you anywhere near Apache camps when we launch our offensive, you'll be treated as a hostile combatant. Do I make myself clear?" Jake left Fort Bowie that afternoon, escorted to the gate, and watched until he was out of sight. He rode for an hour before stopping to water his horse and collect his thoughts. The meeting had been a complete failure, as Goyen had predicted. Worse, he'd learned that the offensive was scheduled to begin in 3 days. The army was bringing in reinforcements from 2 other forts, planning a coordinated attack that would sweep through the mountains and drive the Apache out of their hiding places, forcing them onto reservations or killing them in the process. Jake had to get back to the village and warn them. Give them time to evacuate their families and prepare whatever defense they could mount. But as Jake rode back toward the mountains, he was overcome by the futility of it all. What good would his warning do? The Apache already knew an attack was coming. They were already preparing. His message would only confirm what they already suspected, and it wouldn't change the outcome. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Jake felt a rage building inside him, a fury at the injustice of it all, at the callousness of men like Brennan, who could speak of human beings as obstacles to be removed at a system that rewarded violence and punished compassion. He thought about his father's ideals, the belief that honor and righteousness would prevail, and for the first time, Jake understood that his father had been wrong. The world didn't reward goodness. It crushed it. When Jake arrived back at the village 2 days later, exhausted and dispirited, he found preparations in full swing. The women and children had been moved to more remote locations. The warriors had stockpiled what weapons and ammunition they could gather, and defensive positions had been prepared in the narrow canyons that provided access to the valley. Daklugi greeted Jake grimly, and through the interpreter, Jake confirmed what they already feared. The attack would come soon, probably within a day or two, and it would be overwhelming. They would fight, Daklugi said simply, because they had no choice. They would fight for their families, for their land, for their dignity as a people. They would likely die, but they would die as warriors, not as prisoners. Jake felt tears burning in his eyes, overwhelmed by the courage and the tragedy of it all. That night, the village held a ceremony. Diane spoke words that the interpreter translated, thanking the spirits for bringing Jake to them, for showing them that not all white men were monsters, for giving them hope even in their darkest hour. Then Dawa stepped forward with Nako, and they approached Jake together. She spoke at length, her voice strong despite the tears on her face, and the interpreter conveyed her message. She said that when Nako had been lost in the desert, dying under the merciless sun, the spirits had sent Jake to save him. That act had created a bond stronger than blood, a bond that transcended the hatred between their peoples. She said that no matter what happened in the coming days, no matter who lived or died, Jake would always be family to her son, and her son would always be family to Jake. Then she did something that made Jake's throat tight with emotion. She placed a hand on his chest and a hand on Nako's chest and spoke a single word in Apache. Brother. The interpreter didn't need to translate. Jake understood. He knelt before Nako, this boy he'd known for less than a week, and embraced him as tears flowed freely down his weathered face, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, he had found something he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. He had found family. He had found purpose. And he would fight to protect both with everything he had. On the day Jake Thornton died, at the age of 73, the entire Apache community came to honor him. They performed ceremonies that lasted for days, celebrating a life that had been defined not by what he took from the world, but by what he gave to it. Nako, now a respected elder himself, spoke at the funeral, telling the story of the cowboy who had saved him in the desert one more time, his voice breaking with emotion as he explained to the younger generation what this man had meant not just to him personally, but to their entire people. He told them that Jake had taught him that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing what was right even when you were terrified. That honor wasn't about following your own people blindly, but about standing up for justice, even when it meant standing alone. Jake was buried in a spot he had chosen himself on a hill, overlooking both the Apache territory and the lands where settlers had built their ranches and towns, a symbolic position between two worlds he'd spent his life trying to unite. On his grave marker, at Nako's insistence, they carved an image of a hawk and an inscription in both English and Apache. It read simply, "He saw a child who needed help, and he helped." Everything else followed from that. The peace that Jake had helped forge wasn't perfect, and it didn't last forever. The forces of expansion and greed eventually eroded many of the promises made in those treaties. The Apache people continued to face hardship and injustice in the years that followed. But the story of Jake and Nako remained, passed down through generations, a reminder that individuals matter, that choices matter, that one person deciding to act with compassion rather than indifference can alter the trajectory of countless lives. In the end, Jake Thornton's legacy wasn't measured in land acquired or wealth accumulated or enemies defeated. It was measured in lives saved, in families kept together, in a moment of understanding achieved between peoples who had been taught to hate each other. It was measured in a little wooden hawk that Jake had kept with him every day of his life after Nako gave it to him. Worn smooth by the touch of his hands, a tangible reminder of what one act of kindness had created. The story asks us to consider what we would do, faced with a similar choice. Would we stop to help someone in need, even if that person belonged to a group we've been taught to fear or hate? Would we risk our safety, our livelihood, our future for a stranger? Would we have the courage to stand against injustice, even when doing so meant standing against our own people? These aren't easy questions, and Jake Thornton didn't have easy answers. He simply knew, in that moment in the desert when he found a dying child, that turning away would cost him something more valuable than his life. It would cost him his humanity. And that was a price he wasn't willing to pay. So he stopped. He helped. He saved a life. And in doing so, he saved his own soul and sparked a chain of events that proved what the cynics and the haters have always denied. That compassion is not weakness. That mercy is not foolishness. That the bonds that unite us as human beings are stronger than the fears and prejudices that divide us. 150 warriors stood beside Jake Thornton not because he was powerful, but because he was good. Not because he offered them advantage, but because he offered them respect. Not because he belonged to their tribe, but because he proved that tribe doesn't matter as much as character. That blood is less important than honor, that being human means recognizing the humanity in others even, especially when the world tells you they are your enemy. That is the legacy of the cowboy who saved a lost Indigenous child. That is the truth that echoed across the American West and continues to echo through time, calling to each of us to make the same choice Jake made, to stop when we'd rather keep riding, to help when it would be easier to ignore, to stand up when it would be safer to stay silent. Because the world changes not through grand gestures or sweeping movements, but through individual moments of courage and compassion. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one life saved at a time. Jake Thornton understood that. And in understanding it, in living it, he became something more than a cowboy, more than a hero, more than a legend. He became an example of what we all could be. If only we had the courage to choose love over fear, action over apathy, humanity over hatred. That is his gift to us, passed down through the generations, waiting for each of us to unwrap it and make it our own.